Hello, I'm Dr. Esmacher, and today we're going to talk about the United States and the end of the Cold War. So, last session we talked about how Ronald Reagan had a plan to accelerate the end of the Cold War by basically outspending the Soviet Union on military buildup. And this was a pretty effective plan because the Soviet Union had been teetering on the brink of economic collapse, had faced growing unrest. So today we're going to talk about what happens when the Soviet Union finally does collapse. We're going to talk about revolution and political change in other places in the globe at the same time period in the late 80s and early 90s. And then we're going to address the big question: what do you do with American foreign policy once the Cold War is over? Now that you no longer have this one big bad antagonist in the Soviet Union, what's US foreign policy going to look like? So, we're going to talk about how both George H.W. Bush and then Bill Clinton try to come up with a unified version of American foreign policy to adjust for a post Cold War world. So, we'll talk a little bit about the presidency of the elder Bush and the beginnings of the Clinton presidency today. And we're going to focus on the 1990s and the Clinton years in a little bit more detail in the next session. So let's dive in. So George H.W. Bush had served as the vice presidential candidate and vice president after he was elected for Ronald Reagan. And Bush had a long career in politics prior to being elected in the presidency. And he is going to be the president who oversees the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So, because of this, George H.W. Bush's foreign policy is pretty much the centerpiece of his presidency. Not only do we have the end of the Cold War, but we also have the first Gulf War, which we'll talk a little bit more about, which becomes the first major armed conflict the United States is involved in post-Cold War. But while foreign policy and dealing with foreign policy is really Bush's primary focus, the domestic part of it doesn't really register. The United States is still having some economic issues. Remember, the second Gilded Age we talked about in the 1980s didn't extend down to the middle or lower class. So there's still a lot of economic disruption going on at the lower level for Americans. And we're also having to deal with the fact that Ronald Reagan left office with a pretty big deficit to the US budget. So there's also that concern about having a deficit of over $1 trillion in the US budget. So that ultimately will be George H.W. Bush's Achilles heel when he goes up for re-election in 1992, which we'll talk about later.